Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, FDA and USDA Regulatory Updates, What You Need to Know. I'm excited to have Doug Marshall here with me today, hosting the webinar. I am Amy Knock, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know more about how the webinar will run. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be available for you within 3 business days. A short Q&A session will follow the presentation to answer any viewer-submitted questions. During the webinar, you can submit questions you have using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the Questions tab, type in your question, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. That concludes my brief introduction today. Doug, I will now pass the webinar off to you. You may begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, Amy. And as always, it's a huge pleasure for me to spend about an hour with you. I do want to give you a couple of announcements related to the content of this webinar. So number one, I am not affiliated with FDA or USDA. So my comments related to the content are my comments only and are not reflective of either agency, nor is it reflective of the opinions of Eurofins. What you're going to see today is really, I'll use the term brain barf because it's provocative, right? But I've got a lot of updated information for you related to the activities of these 2 regulatory agencies. The focus of the talk is primarily for those of you making ready-to-eat foods. So you won't hear me say a lot about the raw side, except for some of the things when we talk about USDA. You also won't hear me mention much about dietary supplements. So if you're in those 2 sectors, just be aware I'm not ignoring you. I just didn't have enough time in an hour to provide all kinds of information. This information is up to date as of December 31st. 2021. So anything that has happened in the intervening 3 months is not going to be represented in what I'm going to tell you about today. So with those disclaimers, let's move on. So FDA has some updated resources for manufacturers related to helping you manage COVID-19. These have been promulgated and updated a little bit over the years, but the whole point here is designed to make food manufacturers and their supply chain safe for workers. So I'm not going to go into details here, but again, these are recommendations that have been in place for a couple of years now. FDA is continuing to show some interest in zero tolerance. And this slide is a flirtation with zero, and we already know that FDA has a zero tolerance for pathogens in ready-to-eat foods, so that's nothing new. They also have a zero tolerance for unlabeled allergens in food, so again, nothing new there. However, what this interest by FDA is more on the presence of toxic chemicals. And in this case, zero is defined as the minimum detectable level. It's not necessarily the level at which causes harm, it's just from an analytical perspective, the lowest level that we can detect using analytical methodology. And so as this methodology improves, perhaps we are seeing a decrease in that minimum detectable levels. So FDA has promulgated what's called a closer to zero action plan. And this studies the impacts of primarily metal element exposure as it relates to nutrition at crucial stages of infant and childhood development. So FDA is going to be placing greater emphasis to try and reduce levels of these potentially harmful metals in foods destined for that consumer group. FDA, as it usually does, issues a pesticide report, and the latest report came out with 2019 sampling, and the program targets what they consider to be high-risk products, and 70% of the products tested are imported products. So in that year, they tested over 4,500 samples for 812 pesticides. And the really remarkable findings are that there were no residues detected in 42% of domestic products and 49% of imported products. So products are pretty clean. Of those domestic products, however, where a residue was detected, 99% were compliant with the residue standards. So again, just because you find a pesticide residue in a product doesn't make it unsafe, because the dose makes the poison. And finding minute amounts of harmful chemicals in foods has not been associated generally with public health impact. Imported products, of those that had a residue, about 90% of those were compliant. So again, my interpretation is the picture on residues looks really good for the consuming public here in the US. Let's talk about PFAS. These are per and polyfluoroalkylated substances, and they're a class of chemical contaminants. There's greater than 12 different congeners within the PFAS family. These are widely used as materials in things like a non-stick cookware, in packaging, flame retardants, and so forth. The problem is these are very, very persistent chemicals in the environment. They don't break down. So once they're in the environment, they stay there. There is some association with toxic effects with humans, primarily associated with thyroid defects, reproductive organ tissue problems, and perhaps issues with developing fetus and kidneys. The MRLs for these big class of chemicals is published in that link there. And when FDA did some surveillance last year, this is what they found. They found 7 of 440 samples with detectable PFAS, but the samples that were positive were pretty narrowly focused on a particular food category, and that was fish. And as a result of that, FDA is doing continuing sampling of seafoods to see how widespread this level of contamination is. So as a result, FDA issued a letter to industry reminding the industry that only certain kinds of packaging materials can be used for food contact, and these obviously should not contain PFAS residues. EPA has also done a survey of some non-food package containers, and they found PFAS residues in those. So make sure you're communicating with your package and your film suppliers to make sure you're not inheriting a PFAS issue from your supply chain. Sticking with seafoods for a little bit, FDA issued an advice on eating fish. This is in response to consumer advocacy groups that proclaim that mercury in fish is unsafe. And the reason why FDA got into the game is they're discouraged because people are afraid to feed fish to pregnant women and to children. But we know that fish are high in omega-3 fatty acids, which are essential for proper neuron development and childhood development. So also aids in immune system. So consumption that eat food. Some marine animals, especially the large predatory food fish, can accumulate mercury in their edible tissues. So the higher up the food chain that fish is, the more mercury is going to be accumulated in the muscle tissues. And it is believed that too much exposure to methylmercury over time can cause brain and nervous system dysfunction. So FDA came out with serving size recommendations, and so I'm not going to dwell on those. You can see those. And they're encouraging people to eat at least 2 servings a week from fish that are in the best choices list. And I'll show you that list in a second. Individuals who are pregnant or breastfeeding, their recommendation is to eat a smaller portion size, but still eat 2 to 3 servings a week from the best, or 1 serving from the good list. So this is the list. I mean, if you are in the business of adding seafoods into your products, you may want to ask the question, are we choosing fish from the avoid choices list, or are we choosing fish from the good or from the best? Continuing on with seafoods, fish decomposition and histamine. So histamine is a biogenic amine that is formed in certain kinds of fish that have high levels of the amino acid histidine in their flesh. And so due to microbial growth and metabolism during decomposition under non-refrigerated conditions, such as on the boat or such as on a harvesting line, then these microbes can convert histidine to histamine. And if you consume histamine, you get an allergic type response. If you're really sensitive, you can get a potentially lethal response. So your trachea can constrict and you can die of asphyxiation. So FDA is going to lower the action limit from 50 parts per million to 35 parts per million. And for one way to render a fish as unsafe because it's decomposed. They're also going to lower the action limit from 500 to 200 to judge a product adulterated due to the presence of a deleterious substance. So this hasn't gone into effect yet, so keep an eye out for when this happens. Okay, because of these issues with seafoods, FDA is also going to do something new for them, and they're going to explore using artificial intelligence to try and look at imported seafoods and measure their risk. You can't sample every container that comes in, and we know that about 94% of the seafood consumed in the US comes from import supplies. So the program is ongoing. Stay tuned for the results. FDA also came out with some advice on sodium reduction. So there is concern with the sodium levels found in foods. If you're in product development, you know that adding salt improves the taste sensation of almost every kind of food. But it's not uncommon to have some foods that are at or very near your maximum recommended daily sodium intake of 2,300 milligrams a day. The average consumer consumes about 50% greater than that amount. So FDA is trying to force industry to do voluntary sodium reduction in their products. The reason why is because people who have salt-sensitive high blood pressure need to watch the amount of salt that they consume, and that's the rationale. So there are individual sodium reduction targets for 163 different subcategories. I list the hot link to those categories. And the goal for the first 2.5 years of this program is to have industry voluntarily reduce sodium by 12% over that period. And again, this is every kind of product, the average daily consumption for people. So we shall see if this works. FDA is going to monitor the sodium content of the food supply to be able to measure progress towards this goal. And based on that information, then they are going to likely further reduce the sodium target. So again, it's going to be steady stepwise downward, hopefully. And we'll see if you in the industry are doing your part to make this happen. Okay, here's some updates on FSMA. One is laboratory accreditation rule was published. Bit of confusion about what that means in terms of your relationship with urethans. Bottom line is, really has no impact on your regular routine testing. So it doesn't apply to laboratories that do that testing. What it does apply to are laboratories that do regulatory samples, such as for releasing import products or products that have been subject to a voluntary or involuntary recall. So again, doesn't have an impact on your regular routine testing, but if you're trying to get detained products through the border, then laboratories doing that testing will have to be accredited according to these rules. More FSMA activities, and this was to clarify kind of the cloudiness between FSMA versus other historical food safety management rules, such as the juice Hassip Rule, the seafood Hassip Rule, and the low acid canned foods rule. So it's really designed to put more expectations on processors under these legacy rules in terms of what else do they need to be doing to be FSMA compliant. Now, the obvious one is they need to be current with the current good manufacturing practices. But again, you can go to that link and get more details. There's also a new guideline for central kitchens in transportation caterers. So these are the home delivery kinds of business models that, trying to determine whether you fall under the FDA food code, which is for food service and retailers, or whether you fall under FSMA, which is for food manufacturers. And so there's some clarification guidelines associated with that kind of business model. Oh my, what happened here? Sorry about that. My computer had a brain fart. Good grief. Well, I know what's going on. I'm hitting URLs in the slide deck. Sorry about that. Let's try that. There we go. Note to self, when you're giving presentations, watch out for URLs embedded in your slides. All right, sorry. Additional FSMA updates is they eventually finally published a pre-harvest ag water rule. There was a lot of feedback from the ag sector and from the laboratory sector in terms of their initial guidelines, and so they finally published this, and it is now in force. So if you are sourcing raw agricultural commodities, I think one of your expectations for supplier verification is to make sure that your growers are compliant with this new produce rule. FDA is attempting to harmonize compliance dates, primarily for products that new regulations came out in 2021 and will come out in 2022. And so they're expecting that that compliance date will be January 1. However, there's one notable exception that I was able to find, and that's the FASTER Act. And this act designated sesame as the 9th regulated allergen in the US, and that will become effective January 1. But I can tell you that there are some regulatory actions that have occurred encouraging voluntary recalls for undeclared sesame in foods. So just because the act goes into place January 1, FDA is acting now because this is a potentially deadly, out of control food safety situation. So right now, sesame should be voluntarily labeled, and make sure you don't forget ingredients that come from sesame. So a lot of the recalls are from products that don't use sesame seed as an ingredient, but they use materials that originated from sesame. Things like tahini that's used in hummus and other uses. So just make sure that if you use flavors or spices that have sesame, that you're properly declaring those on the label. FDA is also introducing what's called a new era of smarter food safety. And there's 4 components of that. Tech-enabled traceability, and so you're seeing that in the expectations that FDA has on traceability. Smarter tools for prevention and outbreak responses. This is primarily FDA looking because they are quite frankly slow in resolving outbreaks and communicating outbreaks, and they have a goal to reduce that amount of time between when an outbreak is noticed and when FDA makes recall notifications and communicates to industry and to consumers. There's a new business model for in retail modernization, and again, primarily for the explosion of home delivery as a business model. And then the last one is a new item, and that's related to food safety culture. So trying to encourage food manufacturers to have a company-wide food safety culture that is preventive rather than reactive. The food traceability proposed rule, as I mentioned, is part of this. And they put together what's called a food traceability list that lists food items that processors must maintain records associated with critical tracking events. And this foods on this list were based on FDA's risk ranking. So if the food is a higher risk food, according to FDA, it's going to be on that list. The model links certain food types with sometimes specific hazardous risks. So for example, leafy greens with E. coli on 157, soft cheeses with Listeria monocytogenes, and deli salads also would be something that could be on the list. So it applies to both commodities and ingredients as well as certain products. Critical tracking events. So there are things related to growing, receiving, who the first receiver is, whether you are a manufacturer who creates or transforms, and then food safety events related to shipping. The key data elements associated with this activity are going to be production records, reference records such as bill of lading, who you purchase from. It's going to focus on whatever list of foods or ingredients that are on that key tracking list, lot codes, and so forth. So keep a lookout. Compliance date will be 60 days after publication of the final rule. So you may not have a 2-year grace period in this regard. What does the outbreak improvement plan look like for FDA? Well, it's going to be pretty much everything that they've already done. It's mostly going to be focused on subtyping and whole genome sequencing to be able to more quickly link an outbreak microbial strain to a specific food. So you're going to see more of that. That's not going to go away. The approach is going to be looking at greater reliance on victim, restaurant, and grocery store purchase histories. So that's pretty easy to do today because all you have to do is follow a credit card receipt. There's going to be greater interagency cooperation between FDA and CDC, between FDA, CDC, and USDA, and then state public health authorities. FDA was concerned about the risk associated with delis, and they have looked at whether or not this truly is a high-risk food sector or not. And so what they did is they did a survey, and what they found was most delis were compliant with glove use and temperature monitoring. And the leading deficiencies in that sector were hand washing, improper refrigeration temperatures, and improper cooling of foods to get them down to refrigeration temperatures. All right, FDA does some targeted sampling programs, And oftentimes that's a signal to upcoming rules or regulations. So what they did last year was they targeted fresh herbs, and they were looking for the domestic and imports, and they were looking for specific microbial pathogens. And the results demonstrated that there was a low level contamination risk for things like salmonella, sugar toxin producing E. coli, and cyclospora, both in domestic products as well as import products. None of the products sampled, so over 1,000 products were sampled, and there was no E. coli 0157H7 found in these products. So whether this is good or bad for industry, I don't know. I will tell you that because they found a fair amount of product contaminated with cyclospora, that has led to a cyclospora action plan. So what do we know about cyclospora? So Cyclospora caetanensis is a parasite historically associated with imports, but as the results I just showed you, now it's also considered to be a domestic problem. It has been historically associated with produce outbreaks, including a recent bag lettuce outbreak in 2020, which I happen to have been a victim of. Thank you very much. The plan is designed to improve prevention, enhance response activities, and fill knowledge gaps. The FDA also did an avocado sampling program. What they were looking at is processed avocado. So these would be things like guacamole is probably the best product example. And they were looking for salmonella and listeria. They compared both the domestic findings as well as import findings. So on the domestic side, they found, again, a low prevalence rate of salmonella, and there was no salmonella in the import products. But there was a fair amount of Listeria monocytogenes found in both. So again, Listeria in about 2% of the products. So what that means going forward for the guacamole industry, I don't know, but certainly that's on FDA's radar screen. Okay, let's talk about Genome Tracker and its use. And FDA did a cost-benefit analysis, and what they demonstrated was for every isolate that was typed, they believe that they're probably saving between $100 to $450 million a year in healthcare costs. And they believe that they're saving that then as a result of improved consumer safety. Okay, let's turn now to USDA and think about some things that they've worked on. Two really, really important things if you are a meat and poultry cooking operation. Number one, they've updated Appendix A, which are guidelines for cooking of meat and poultry. So it doesn't cover a couple of items, things like catfish, pork rinds, lard, and tallow. And it doesn't cover things that are processed under dry conditions, such as country cured hams. And it also doesn't cover non-ready to eat, partially heated products. So these would be things like a chicken breast in a microwave entree that has grill marks on it, but it's not thoroughly cooked. That's a tough business to be in because folks who have tried that have gone out of business because they've given people salmonella, but whatever. So these not ready to eat, but partially heated products, the hazards are going to be addressed under stabilization guidelines, so cooling guidelines. And the expectation here is that the consumer is going to properly cook that product prior to consumption. Then it also doesn't cover some RTE multi-hurdle products such as fermented dry sausages. In addition to Appendix A, USDA also updated Appendix B, and these are the stabilization, aka cooling guidelines for meat and poultry. So you can get a hot link to that appendix at the bottom. Okay, U.S. Food Safety Inspection Service also was interested in delis, so they did their own study. And it was a study that they started in 2016 and discontinued it last year. They were looking at retail delicatessens, and they were looking at compliance with Listeria controls guidance. And the results of that study demonstrated a high rate of compliance. So here we have FDA coming to a similar conclusion that USDA did in terms of the safety of delis. So that's great news, right? So I don't have to be that worried next time I go to the grocery store to pick up a quick lunch. Like FDA, USDA also has a residue testing program of meat, poultry, and egg samples. And they tested almost 8,000 different products for 21 chemical residues. Excuse me, for chemical residues. Of those 7,776 samples, only 21 of those samples had a residue violation. So that's a really low, way less than a half a percent the violation rate, which has been going down steadily over the years. None of the egg samples had any violative residues, and people who believe that imported products are unsafe relative to domestic products, here's a piece of data that might argue otherwise. So they tested 3,500 import products with only 7 residue violations, which is a violation rate of less than 0.2%. The egg Hassip Rule became effective October 31. So if you are subject to that rule, then egg Hassip is for you. Allergen precautionary labeling. USDA says that if you're going to use these precautionary statements, rather than just actually declare an allergenic ingredient on the label, then you have to supply FSIS with a statement for why you cannot eliminate that precautionary statement from the label. So a precautionary statement would be something like, produced in a plant that also manufactures an allergenic product, or a statement that says may contain. So these statements sometimes don't prevent an allergy sufferer from actually trying a product if that allergen isn't listed as an ingredient. So they're willing to take their chances because their food choices are so limited that they're just dying to try and to increase the foods that they can eat. And so they're going to trust the manufacturer that even though you have this precautionary statement that, you know, your product's actually going to be okay for me to eat. So it's just really, really poor risk reduction strategy to use this. And FSIS wants to know why. There's also updated guidelines on labeling of meal kits. So again, these are going to be the things where you get a box of meal items, and you're supposed to prepare it in your kitchen. Oh no, did I do that again? I believe I did.
I think you did.
Silly me.
No.
Oh no. Please stop. Okay. Thank goodness I rescued myself. All right, USDA enforcement. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these enforcement items, but this one I thought was intriguing because it relates to a relationship between a food manufacturer and their laboratory. New England Meatpacking in Connecticut, the owner was convicted of a felony for knowingly and willingly making 36 false documents Namely, these were false laboratory certificates of analysis, and they were related to carcass swabs from ground beef samples for E. coli testing. And he basically just cooked up laboratory reports to suit his needs so that he could ship product. Well, you know, you get a felony, you're going to go out of business, and you're going to go to jail, and you're going to get a big fine. So don't do this. Okay, foodborne disease summary. 2021 was intriguing because there was a 26% reduction in the number of foodborne infections. And of course, the question is why? Now the regulators are going to go, woohoo, that's because we're doing such a great job. Yeah, not so fast there, folks. So what are some potential reasons for this dramatic reduction? Well, number one, because everybody was so focused on COVID, there was improved healthcare seeking behaviors. So that means that people weren't practicing risky behaviors like eating a bunch of, I'm going to say this, I'm going to piss somebody off, but whatever. Eating a bunch of raw sprouts and raw oysters every morning for breakfast over the course of a year, right? Improve hygienic practices, both at the home, because we were doing a lot more food preparation at home. There were fewer inspections, surveillance, and epidemiological investigations because everybody in the public health sector was focused on COVID and not on foodborne disease. And then there's altered food consumption practices. So this is what I think might be a big contributor, fewer restaurant visits. So, you know, I think that's one of the riskier things you can do in life is go eat out in a restaurant. But, you know, who's going to give up that convenience and that opportunity to taste tasty foods with friends? A risk worth taking, I think most people would say. All right, leafy greens outbreaks. Multi-year outbreaks have been associated with fresh produce being grown in close proximity to livestock production areas. This is a story that's occurred over and over and over again. And because of this, FDA now considers the California Central Coast leafy greens area at a risk for pathogenic E. coli, and that's reasonably foreseeable within the FSMA produce safety rule. So farmers and ranchers growing leafies in this area need to be doing some preventive controls to reduce the potential for contamination. This is a big step. But leafies aren't the only culprit. So we've had salmonella in onions. Those of you who know something about onions know that they contain an ingredient, or not an ingredient, but a substance called allyl isothiocyanate. So you have a sulfur compound and you got a cyanide compound all in one molecule. I mean, geez, talk about a wonderful natural toxin. But when you cut an onion and that volatilizes and gets into your tears, it hydrolyzes into sulfur and cyanide, and that's what causes the burning sensation in your eyes. But that's also antimicrobial, and so we know that a onion bulb has a long shelf life, and even when you cut an onion and you put the unused portion in your refrigerator, it has a long shelf life. But salmonella that gets on the dry skin of the onion can survive for many, many months, if not years. We've seen salmonella outbreak associated with orchard peaches. And when they did a survey of that orchard, they found salmonella on the leaves of the trees. Now the fruit has already been picked, but the affected orchard was adjacent to a concentrated agriculture producing facility that had poultry and cattle. So you think, okay, well, what about growing your fresh produce in an environment that isn't close to concentrated agriculture? Well, guess what? Salmonella didn't read the book, so it decided to rewrite the book, and there was a salmonellosis outbreak associated with hydroponic greenhouse-grown leafy greens. They found salmonella in the indoor production pond water. They found in the growth media storage area. There was a contaminated retention pond. So these sanitation deficiencies were evidence that the food contact surfaces weren't held in sanitary condition, and the leafies got contaminated with salmonella. Some additional recall summaries here, really the usual suspects. So nothing particularly remarkable about the recalls last year, either in meat and poultry. Here's a couple on the allergen side, and that was people adding ingredients that had allergenic ingredients that weren't declared on the label. So sesame oil and sesame seeds, anchovies in salad dressing, and anchovies in Worcestershire sauce. Just some more. You can look at these when you get the slide deck. Foreign material, again, nothing particularly interesting here other than excessive lead in a spice mix caused about 700,000 pounds recalled of canned beef with gravy. Salmonella, again, foods from animal origin were the big culprits here. Listeria, again, ready-to-eat meat products were the big culprits. 9 million pound recall associated with ready-to-eat chicken. Other pathogens, pathogenic E. coli, again, associated with ground beef. Then we had a strange one, Bacillus cereus in ready-to-eat pepperoni that was discovered by company testing. And not really sure why the company would be testing for Bacillus cereus in pepperoni, but they found it, and that led to a recall. Okay, inspection violations. Summary here is primarily related to USDA regulated products and the failure of companies with their supply chain verification program, making sure that if you're sourcing poultry and meat and catfish, that you're sourcing it from approved manufacturers. All right, what many may consider to be the biggest regulatory news, and folks, this is completely tongue-in-cheek, and that is French salad dressing had its standard of identity revoked. And the pictures here kind of demonstrate the problem with French salad dressing, in that almost no manufacturer of French salad dressing was actually following the standard of identity. So the one here on the left is creamy French dressing. So it's not called French dressing, it's called creamy. This one is called California French style dressing. And this one is sweet and spicy French. So a lot of variability in the contents of this French dressing, and almost no one was selling anything that was just called French dressing because it's really kind of a boring salad dressing. So FDA revoked the standard of identity. All right, Amy, guess what? We've got time for questions, and I appreciate you sitting with me. This was a lot of stuff in one talk, and I'll be happy to attempt to address questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Doug, for your presentation. I just want to add the polling question here. Just launch this right now. Again, if you would like someone from Eurofins to follow up with you after the webinar, just go ahead and select the yes button and we will follow up with you. The first question, Doug, that came in, are there recommendations for less sugar content in food?
To my knowledge, I do not believe the regulatory agencies are in the business of limiting the sugar content in food. However, for labeling purposes, obviously sugar content is an important component of a legitimate label, as well as added sugar. So you need to make sure that those two items are on your nutritional facts panel.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question here that has come in, does the recommended decrease in sodium apply to imported products?
Indeed, it does.
Wonderful, thank you. Then the next one, does the requirement to control hazards of water include pathogen testing of potable water used for growing or processing of food?
If the food, in this case, is produce and it falls under the produce safety rule, then FDA is expecting that growers and processors will conduct a hazard assessment of that water supply. And as part of that hazard assessment, if you identify pathogens as reasonably foreseeable, then one way you can verify that that water that is used for direct product contact surface, either as irrigation water or as processing water, will be free of pathogens. So
Great.
it doesn't specifically say you need to be testing for pathogens, I think. But if you believe that pathogens are reasonably foreseeable, then that's a good way to verify that that water, when used, is safe for use.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think we have one final question here for today. Avocado oil is increasing in popularity. What are the pathogenic risks associated with this particular oil?
Okay, interesting question. The answer really depends on how the oil is processed. So if it is a fresh pressed oil where there's no heat treatment used to strip off flavors or to strip off colors, in other words, if it's not a refined oil, then pathogens can potentially get into the oil and they can potentially survive. How long that survival rate is, I don't know. I will tell you from a laboratory testing perspective, testing oils is a real challenge for the laboratory because water and oil separates and we do aqueous-based testing. So that's kind of a challenge. What I will tell you is I'm not personally aware of avocado oil being involved in an outbreak, but I am aware of other kinds of oils, and the one that I know most about is sesame seed oil. Has been associated with salmonellosis outbreaks. So there is risk there, but it really depends on how the oil is processed and the quality of the raw material going into the process.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like we have caught up with all of the questions. In case we missed any, we certainly will follow up, but that wraps up our time today. I want to remind everyone that a recording of the webinar, along with a copy of the slides that Doug presented, will be available in 3 business days. And I want to thank you again, Doug, for your expertise and your presentation today, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.